Hi everyone, welcome to Music is a Journey. I'm Peter. Today I thought I would make a video about where I am with regards to my musical interests right at this moment. Last week I did a video on my journey into death metal, how I got into listening to death metal, but as I was making that video, I was actually listening to shoegaze bands during that time, and I thought it's kind of strange I'm making a video about death metal when I'm actually enjoying shoegaze or even dream pop music a little bit there. So this has been a journey regarding shoegaze. Now this has been a journey that has been in the making for a very long time, and I felt someday I was going to get there. Already some years ago I watched some videos on YouTube giving the basic background story of shoegaze, who are the famous bands, what are the famous albums, and I even watched a video about Japanese shoegaze bands last summer, I think it was, so I knew I was getting really close. And then there was Richard S. for Richard's Vinyl Tap House, his YouTube channel. Richard talks a lot about shoegaze bands, so I felt, okay, I'm going to listen to what he's talking about because he seems to know what he's talking about. And then there was also Alex at Beer and Vinyl. He said that shoegaze seemed to be something that might be something you could get into. So I felt, okay, yeah, the time is coming up, and this is where I'm at right now. So I wanted to go over about 20 songs from the early days of my interest in music, outlining how it is I arrived at this point where I'm interested in shoegaze music. So we go back, first of all, way back to when I was 11 years old. And the music that caught my attention at the time, that really fascinated me, that I loved listening to, was of course heavy metal. Anyone who knows me and knows my channel knows that heavy metal was my first love. And one of the things that I really loved about it was the guitar distortion. I loved the sound, the tone of a real meaty heavy metal guitar, a really mean one with lots of distortion, and there was nothing like a really cool riff with distorted guitar. So of course there then, from 1982 and throughout to the mid-80s, I was just trying to pick up as many different bands and as many different albums as I could, always looking for those killer riffs. But one day while listening to the radio, I heard a song that really was quite different, and in a very strange way it appealed to me. By chance, I happened to record it off the radio on a cassette player that I had, so I could actually listen to that song over and over again if I wanted to. It was really strange because the guitar player was not playing any riff. There was clearly a rhythm section with drums and bass going on, but the guitarist just seemed to be going anywhere and everywhere he felt, and as well he was playing with a lot of distortion. That song was called The Revenge of Anus Presley by the Butthole Surfers. As the 80s went on, I became very interested in 70s hard rock and early heavy metal, or heavy rock if you will, but by around 87, 88, I started to tire a little bit of the production style of a lot of heavy metal albums. I felt it was getting to be more a show of production rather than product. I started losing interest in the new albums that a lot of the bands I had previously liked were putting out. They just didn't grab me the way that they used to in the early 80s. So I actually not only went back to the 70s, but scrolled even further back into the 1960s. And there was a lot of interesting and exciting music going on, especially a lot of experimentation with guitar distortion, which really intrigued me. There was one band, the Yardbirds, I liked, but the part of the Yardbirds' history I liked best was when Jeff Beck was with the band, just for a very short time really. A lot of the songs he did introduced guitar distortion, more heavier, harder hitting guitar, and then there was one song called Someone to Love. They did a Someone to Love Part 2 backing track, which was just an instrumental, and for this Jeff Beck experimented with guitar distortion, sometimes actually playing the melody of the song, sometimes just letting the guitar drone and feedback, and sometimes crashing down some chords. He just did a lot of experimental guitar in that song, or in that track, which was really cool. Now, when it comes to 60s songs, psychedelic songs with feedback, there's a number of ones you could mention. Of course, Jefferson Airplane had some great examples of feedback in some of their songs. You have the whole Steppenwolf Magic Carpet Ride opening, but one of my absolute favorite bands for use of guitar distortion and feedback and guitar effects was Iron Butterfly. A few of their tracks there over those first 3 albums in the 60s have some great examples, including some songs off the 3rd album, Ball. But my favorite Iron Butterfly track is the Iron Butterfly theme from their debut album Heavy, released in January of 1968. This instrumental track just features really great distorted guitar sounds, guitar effects, pick slides, all sorts of cool things going on. And at the very end, we get this droning, buzzing guitar note, and finally this cacophonous crash as this Iron Butterfly slams into the earth, with the whole band just joining in and making this big explosive sound. In my final years of high school, I was in the acting club, and there were a couple of people in the acting club whose tastes in music were a little bit off from mine. And one guy, I remember, he talked a lot about the Jesus and Mary chain. So one day we had to drive somewhere together for our acting club thing, and he played some Jesus and Mary chain in the car. And I thought, well, the guitar sounds pretty cool. I'm not so keen on the kind of electronic drumming so much, but the guitar sounds really neat, so maybe I'll pick up a Jesus and Mary chain album. So it took a couple of years, but finally, in the early 90s, I picked up Automatic. Yeah, I liked the guitar tone. I liked the riff for a song called Blues from a Gun, but in the end, I just really didn't dig the beats. There was a kind of electronic beat feel. There was a kind of pulsing synthesizer feel. I don't remember exactly, but in the end, the album just didn't grab me and I let it go. In case you're wondering, in recent weeks, I have actually watched some videos on the history of shoegaze, what led up to shoegaze, and Jesus and Mary Chain get mentioned often, especially for their album Psycho Candy. So I have given it a listen on YouTube, and it does sound intriguing, so I might have to go back to Jesus and Mary Chain, but just pick up something that is a little more, acerbic? So, moving on from Automatic and Jesus and Mary Chain, we're going to take a very interesting side step into what I consider to be part of my interest in music that is something we can find in shoegaze and dream pop, and that is very beautiful vocal melodies sung particularly by a woman, and then very high and soft and ethereal. And that artist I was introduced to by a girlfriend back around 1992, and that was Enya. By, I think, early 1993, I bought an album that really is still actually one of my favorites. This is an album that dropped shoegaze almost directly into my lap, and I loved it. I was watching a show on CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation channel, and it was a show called Ear to the Ground. That program was a half-hour program that featured one new upcoming Canadian artist and talked about their music and interviewed them and so on. And the very first episode I watched was this band out of Halifax called Sloan. Now, the music that I heard in the background and the look of the band, it just really intrigued me. This was not metal, of course. This was not punk rock either. It wasn't pop. It wasn't grunge exactly. What exactly was this? So I went out and bought their debut album, Smeared. And the interesting story about Smeared is that Sloan were of the Halifax underground scene. And a lot of their early music sounds very similar to like Husker Du or particularly Dinosaur Jr. I know that they were interested in the music of Husker Du. And they actually recorded an EP of songs, which was a Halifax underground, slightly Dinosaur Jr.-ish type of an album. It's called Peppermint. But around the same time, they got picked up by the David Geffen Company and were asked to record an album. So they took a couple of the songs that they recorded for Peppermint, the Peppermint EP, and they just had them remixed to give it a more less indie sounding recording. But other songs they completely re-recorded and then added some other newer tracks. And by this time, one member, Jay Ferguson, had introduced another member, Chris Murphy, to Loveless by My Bloody Valentine. And they both thought this is the direction for our band. So the resulting album, Smeared, was a kind of a cross between a harder, more aggressive, almost grunge-like style, blended together with some of these layers of distortion or really crunchy, distorted chords, sometimes with a feedback guitar and feedback effects, as well as softer sung vocals. Particularly Jay Ferguson's vocals gave that natural, lighter, softer sound that seemed to be prevalent on the Loveless album. As well, they also had a female guest singing together with Chris Murphy on one song. So let's just hear a little bit from that here. I Am the Cancer by Sloan and Lemon Zinger by Sloan with Jay Ferguson singing.
Kiss me, I can't wait till you kiss me.
So a lot of people who really love Sloan's music look back at this very first album and say, well, they usually rank it fairly lowly because they say that Sloan's songwriting hadn't really matured yet and they were trying to be a shoegaze band. But this was my introduction to them and I loved it. In fact, the next two albums were not like that at all, and I almost gave up on the band. Fortunately, they went on to do something else that I really liked, and yeah, I've liked every album since then, but they've never done a shoegaze album like this. So of course, knowing that their influence was My Bloody Valentine, sometime after that I did actually pick up Loveless, and I remember I could clearly hear how that album had influenced Sloan's Smeared album. But I think there was something about it. Maybe the production sounded a bit weak or a bit muddy, I'm not sure. But there was something about it that kept me from really embracing the music. And the funny thing is that when I watch these documentaries or, homemade documentaries on the history of shoegaze, anytime I hear samples from the Loveless album, I recognize the music and it sounds really cool. But for some reason, I don't know, my CD, the recording level was a bit too low, so maybe I have to buy the album again, but for now, I don't have it. It was one of those albums that disappeared in the great CD purge of about 12, 13 years ago. So from here on, we reached the mid-90s, and this was around the time that I made the decision that I was going to leave Canada and head off to Japan. It was a 3-year gap from the time that I decided to do so to the time that I finally reached here. And during that time, I decided to try to explore Japanese music to find out what kind of cool music that they have over in Japan. And the very first band that I picked up was Shonen Knife. They were interesting because they are still a pop punk band, so they sometimes have this, fun punk sound, but also they sometimes bring in these more melodic, clean guitar parts, and because they're 3 women, even though they have a regular lead vocalist and then another person doing lead vocals sometimes, they sometimes recorded songs with these actually 3-part harmonies, which we're kind of like looking back to the early 60s. A lot of these all-female groups from the early 60s, or at least all-female singer groups from the 60s. And interestingly, a couple of the videos that I watched, one or possibly 2, talking about the history of shoegaze, where did it come from, the very first song they played was Be My Baby by the Ronettes, as an introduction to it all. So in a way it kind of makes sense. And if you're still wondering how does Shonen Knife fit in with all of this, I found that there is a compilation album of Japanese artists. It's called Yellow Loveless, and it includes 2 tracks by Tokyo Shoegazer, so definitely Japanese shoegaze, but it also includes a track by Shonen Knife. So yeah, we have these female 3-part harmonies, very catchy songs. We also have some melodic clean guitar as well as the more sort of pop punk sound. So Shonen Knife were, I think, an important step in the direction. There was, I don't know if it's still there, but there was a store down in downtown Vancouver called Minna no Konbiniya. Anyway, everyone's convenience store, and they sold all sorts of Japanese snacks and foods, as well as they had Japanese CD rentals. So I sometimes went in and rented some CDs there, and one I remember picking up was a band called Flipper's Guitar. I think what I picked up was a compilation album, but there was one song that always stuck out for me, and it was a song called The Story of My Red Shoes. That song has been in my head ever since the mid-90s, and finally last year I tracked down their debut album, which has that song, for a super cheap price used on an online flea market. So, My Red Shoes. This was, let's say, Flipper Guitar's music was largely inspired, according to what I've read, a lot of these kind of alternative British songs which focused a lot on sweet melodies, almost a kind of naive feel to it, or very young feel to it, and nothing really too aggressive or punky or noisy or anything. Just really pleasant, light, almost innocent type of guitar pop music. Discovering more about Japanese music, I finally came over to visit Japan. I think it was 1997 the first time, then again 98 before I came over here and started living in 99. And of course I hit the music stores and tried to pick up some other interesting artists. One of the things I found there in the late 90s and early 2000s is there were a lot of Japanese bands or individual artists who played guitar and sang really beautiful songs with beautiful melodies, and sometimes put more of a rocky edge to it as well. I noticed that Japanese bands, especially female-led bands or female artists, could write some really beautiful melodies, and at the same time accompany it with some fairly noisy electric guitar. I think in the early 2000s then, thanks to bands like Sum 41, Treble Charger, and I guess to an extent Zucker Baby, I started getting interested in, I guess, pop punk more, this kind of North American style pop punk, as well as, I guess, a kind of modern bubblegum rock type of thing. Anyway, I found that there were a lot of bands that had, again, these really kind of softer, higher vocals, distorted guitar, but very nice melodies, sometimes very beautiful, clean electric guitar, and this was nothing that I actually heard in any of the music that I listened to in the 1980s. I guess throughout the latter half of the 2000s, I was tracing back to bands I used to listen to. So I was getting back into Scorpions and Deep Purple, and that led me on actually to Rush, which led me on to progressive rock. So at this point, it seemed that any further sliding towards shoegaze was temporarily put on hold. However, there was one band, I think they're out of Norway or possibly Sweden, called Motorpsycho, and the album I picked up of theirs, like right off the bat, it's like, wow, this brings me back to the 90s with like a Sloan and My Bloody Valentine or Pavement or some of those other bands I heard at the time. And check this out. So this was kind of a reminder that shoegaze was still out there, or at least something similar to it was still out there. And I actually didn't know about the whole history at that time. I didn't know what was going on in the 70s and the 80s leading up to it. I didn't know about this kind of revival that came later on. But I did find that there was this thing called post-rock, which I think in some ways is similar, and it was starting to show up in some of the progressive bands, particularly some of the progressive metal bands I was checking out. For example, there was this band Wilt, which is actually, I guess it's a black gaze band from Winnipeg. And then I went to see a concert in Tokyo where the opening band was Death Heaven, and in between the heavier parts with the really raw, scratchy vocals, there were some really beautiful, clean guitar parts, which were a fantastic contrast to the heavier stuff. And that prompted me to go out and buy a couple of Death Heaven albums. There was one other band that came to my attention, I guess just about a year or two ago, and that was a band going back to the mid-70s called Simply Saucer. They recorded one album which was part studio tracks and part recorded live on the top of a shopping mall. Apparently the name Simply Saucer was an inspiration from Pink Floyd's Saucer Full of Secrets. Oh, and if we're talking about guitar distortion and feedback, yeah, we could probably also mention Pink Floyd from the 1960s. But anyway, Simply Saucer's album Cyborgs Revisited, it was a mix of kind of 1974 style North American punk rock mixed with some rock and roll, mixed with some psychedelia, mixed with experimental stuff. I mean, they had a theremin player in the band who didn't just do some crazy effects now and again. He's there on pretty much every track, even playing in the rhythm. So sometimes you get these very noisy, distorted guitar instrumental sections with the theremin going, and it's really crazy stuff. So I think by now we've got a compilation of things like I love distortion, guitar distortion, I love feedback distortion effects, wavering sounds, crashing guitars, noisy guitars sometimes, not just always a really bang you in the ass metal riff type of thing. I also like melodies. I like melodies sung in higher, softer voices, particularly female voices, but you know, higher, softer male voices can work too. I like clean guitar with beautiful melodies. I think all these things were setting me up for reaching this point. And so last year, I picked up an album by a band called the Besnard Lakes. And the moment I listened to it, I thought, this band is part shoegaze, part post-rock, and probably something else. And I checked out on Wikipedia, and I found, yes indeed, one of the descriptions of their music is shoegaze. Another band that I just felt inspired to buy out of the blue after hearing Morten Astad talk about it on his channel was an album by a band called Always. Now, Always, yeah, it wasn't shoegaze, but there was this other type of music that I heard people talking about called dream pop, and was that what it was? Later on, I picked up another Always album, and that one featured more of the fuzzy guitars. And in fact, I have since seen two compilations of, you know, top 50 shoegaze songs, or shoegaze mixed with other styles gives you this kind of music, and two of those videos mention songs from that album by Always. So there it was then. I watched that video about Japanese shoegaze, and I picked up a band called Luminous Orange, whom I've mentioned 2 or 3 times now since picking them up at the end of last year. I have 2 of their albums, and one of them is the recommended one from the video about Japanese shoegaze, and it is really, really a great example of a Japanese shoegaze album. It's called Drop You Vivid Colors. I'm thinking to go back and check out some of their older stuff there. It seems that they have some albums from the 90s as well. And then I guess just before we reach this point here, the final stepping stone up to the doorstep, I think, right to the threshold here, was I was checking out actually bands with female artists or young bands, and I stumbled across one called 17 Years Old and Berlin Wall. I thought the video was really cute. The song was very sweet, had some nice guitar melodies as well as some flooding distortion sounds, and so I picked up one of their albums. Actually, they have 5 EPs, as I found out, and I really liked it. I have since picked up 2 more, and I have placed an order for the last 2 that I'm missing, so I will have all of them. 17 Years Old and Berlin Wall, or as they're known in Japanese, 17 歳と Berlin no Kabe. I think I should, actually I neglected to mention it, but I should have also mentioned Phaser Days from New Zealand. She is a dream pop artist, and when I heard people talking about dream pop and I did a search for dream pop songs, I ran into a lot of compilations of, you know, best dream pop, but the first individual song that I found was one called Lucky Girl from Phaser Days. So I'm now finding myself liking this kind of sweet, almost naive, slightly innocent, really pretty guitar, drums, bass music with very soft, pleasant vocals, as well as I like the shoegaze side where it's more of this, swaths of distortion flooding in, but also beautiful melodies coming in there. So we're going to finish this video with the iPhone because the camera battery died. So where I'm taking this from here is I'm checking out lots of different bands. I'm looking for what appeals to me because there are a lot of bands that when I search for shoegaze, they come up. And particularly with Japanese ones, a lot of them don't really feature any guitar distortion, not so much pretty guitar melodies. A lot of times it's just strumming away on an electric guitar and singing what sounds to me like a very generic guitar pop song here in Japan. So there have been a lot of bands like that, but there also have been some interesting ones. So I have to give it a little more time. I've got to be a little more careful. I can't just go out and grab a pile of stuff. Of course, I want to look back to some of the old classic albums. Funny thing, I watched a documentary on one channel that's called Stained Glass Stories. One of their videos was a documentary on the history of Ride. I watched it when I was finishing work the other day, and then I left work and went to the station, and somebody walked past me wearing a Ride t-shirt with the album cover for Nowhere. I thought, what a coincidence. I've never seen that before. But yeah, so I'll be checking out some of the older classic albums. I might be looking for some of the obscure bands. There was a lot of stuff going on in the early part of the 90s or even late 80s as well. Maybe some of these bands that were influential in the development of the shoegaze scene in the 80s. So there's a whole ton of stuff to check out. But again, I want to be selective. I want to get something that I'm going to enjoy listening to, not just, what's this, and then finding, Anyway, that's my story of how it is I arrived here now where I'm interested in shoegaze music. Thank you very much for watching. Comments are appreciated, and we'll see you in another video sometime soon. Take care, everyone. Bye.